At 6:30 p.m. on the evening of November 13, 1974, a 23-year-old man, named Ronald DeFeo Junior, ran into Henry's bar in Amityville, New York.
"You've got to help me!"
he shouted.
"I think my mother and father are shot."
He told the bar patrons that his parents and his 4 siblings had all been shot and killed in what may have been a mob hit. His act was so convincing that someone called the police. After the police searched the house and found 6 bodies, they took him into protective custody while they began their investigation. Included among the victims were the parents, Ronald Sr. and his wife Louise, who had both been 43. Ronald Sr. had been a service manager at the car dealership, Briganti Carl Buick, which was owned by his wife's family. The siblings included 18-year-old Dawn, 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John. All of the victims had been shot with a Marlin 336C rifle. The criminal investigation team determined that the DeFeos had been shot at 3 a.m. that morning. Each of the parents had been shot twice. All of the children had been shot once. Ronald Jr., who was known as Bruce by his family and friends, initially alleged that a mob hitman named Louis Fellini had carried out these killings. He said that Mr. Fellini had not been happy with a paint job that Ronald Jr. had done on his car at the Buick dealership. The two had gotten into a heated argument, and Ronald Jr. said that his father, Ronald Sr., had warned Mr. Fellini that if anything were to ever happen to his son, that he would kill Fellini and his entire family. As the police dug into this story, they found that the seemingly picture-perfect DeFeo family had more than their fair share of problems. One of the problems had been Ronald DeFeo Sr., who reportedly had a temper. His temper had been so bad that he had sometimes beaten his wife and children. Ronald DeFeo Jr. also had a temper. His temper, accompanied by violent outbursts, had resulted in an expulsion from his high school. In addition to not having finished high school, DeFeo Jr. was on probation because he had a criminal record as a thief and as a drug user, who had been addicted to both LSD and heroin. DeFeo Jr. was 18 when Ronald Sr. hired him to work at the dealership. Since this was a family business, the younger DeFeo received a weekly paycheck even for days when he didn't show up to work. Whenever he was at work, Butch worked in the service department, where he did oil changes, tune-ups, and car washes. During the weeks leading up to the killings, Butch had become increasingly violent. During one visit with his girlfriend, Sherry Klein, he began pushing her around so forcefully that she had to escape by climbing through a window. The neighbors told the police about an angry confrontation between Butch and a next-door neighbor named Mrs. Namath. When Junior accused her daughter of having thrown rocks at a religious shrine the DeFeos had placed in their front yard, she responded by saying that her daughter would never do such a thing. This denial made Butch so angry that he began shouting at her. He told her that if she had been a man, he would have punched her in the face. At work, Butch lost his temper after he alleged that the $20,000 his father had given him to deposit at a bank had been lost to a robbery. When his father didn't believe him, Junior pulled out a gun and threatened him. When the police later questioned him about this alleged robbery, they reported that he was uncooperative and violent. At the time of the killings, Butch was on probation for drug usage and for having stolen an outboard motor that had been valued at over $1,700. He would later tell the police that he only kept his job at the dealership because his father let him come and go as he pleased. Since he also needed the paycheck stubs to show his probation officer, working at the dealership had proven to be quite useful even if he wasn't particularly thrilled at having to work for his father. When he was asked to describe his whereabouts on the day of the murders, Butch told the police that he had stayed home from work on Tuesday, November 12, because he had had an upset stomach. He claims that he had watched a late-night movie, Castle Keep, starring Burt Lancaster, and that he had fallen asleep at 2 a.m. in the TV room. After waking at 4 a.m., and going upstairs to change his clothes, he said he heard his brother in the bathroom. The light under the bathroom door was on and he heard his brother flush the toilet. Since he was well rested from the day before, Butch said that he left for work early. After taking the subway to Brooklyn, he had breakfast at a diner, saw his girlfriend, and then went to work after the dealership had opened. When his father didn't come into work, he called home and was surprised when nobody answered. After work, he went to Henry's bar with some friends. At 6 p.m., having still been unable to get in touch with anyone from his home, he said he went home to see if everything was all right. He found everyone dead in their beds and ran back to the bar to get some help. He told the police that he thought his family had been gunned down by a mob hitman named Louis Fellini. The problem with this story was that Louis Fellini had an alibi for the time in question while Butch did not. The murders had taken place sometime around 3 a.m. when Butch, by his own admission, had still been at home. When the police pointed out Butch's anger management issues in the weeks leading up to the murders, and raised the issue of the dealership's lost $20,000, Butch abruptly confessed to having committed 6 murders. Butch's criminal trial began on October 14, 1975. His defense attorney, William Weber, mounted an affirmative defense of insanity by claiming that Butch had killed his family because he had heard voices in his head. While Dr. Harold Zolan, the psychiatrist for the prosecution, testified that DeFeo was still a drug user, and that he had antisocial personality disorder, he also stated that Butch had been aware of his actions at the time of his crime. According to the prosecution, at about 3 a.m., Butch took a rifle from his personal gun collection and went to his parents' bedroom where he shot each of his parents twice. He then went to the bedroom of each of his siblings and shot them one at a time. One of the curious facts about these murders was that nobody appears to have woken up at the sound of the first gunshot. The prosecution never explained how it was possible that all of the victims apparently slept through the sound of several gunshots. The forensics lab also never did a blood test for any of the victims to see if a sedative had been administered. On November 21, 1976, Butch was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive 25-year sentences. The judge, Thomas Stark, would later be quoted as saying that DeFeo's crimes were the most heinous murders committed in Suffolk County since its founding. In 1990, Butch filed a 440 motion to request that his conviction be vacated. In this motion, he alleged that Dawn and an unknown assailant killed his family. After the stranger fled the house, he and Dawn had struggled over the firearm which had accidentally been discharged, killing his sister. Judge Stark denied the motion, writing,
"I find the testimony of the defendant overall to be false and fabricated."
In December of 1975, George and Kathleen Lutz purchased the house for $80,000, which was well below market value. Shortly after having moved into the house, the Lutzes began to experience a series of increasingly frightening paranormal events. Items around the house began moving on their own. Lights would turn on and off by themselves. There were the sound of voices coming from rooms that were empty. Footsteps could be heard running up and down the stairs. At times the home would be filled with the stomach-turning stench of rotting meat. At one point, Kathleen is said to have levitated while lying in bed. The family moved out within 28 days of having moved in. Not only had they not fully unpacked, but when they fled their house, they had to abandon all of their belongings. In 1977, the Lutzes collaborated with author Jay Anson, who would later publish a relatively short 65,000-word novel called The Amityville Horror. The book was wildly successful. By 1981, the book had sold 6.1 million copies. An estimated 5 million copies have been sold over the following 42 years. An astounding 17 movies were subsequently spun off of this book. Although no contracts were ever signed, the Lutzes earned $300,000 from having shared their story with Jay Anson. During an interview about his novel, Jay Anson would later admit that the events that were portrayed in his novel had been fabricated with the Lutzes over several glasses of wine.
"We took real-life incidents and transposed them. In other words, the story was a hoax."
Although George Lutz would spend the rest of his life swearing that everything that had happened to his family was true, his stepson, Christopher Quaratino, who had been 7 when the Lutzes purchased and moved into the Amityville house, would later state the following.
He's a professional showman, in my opinion. I just feel as though we were exploited.
The Amityville house has since been sold and the current occupants have reported no problems with the house. Were it not for one thing, I would have said that the horrific events that took place at this house back in 1974 had not left any psychic scars save for one thing. 2 months after the Lutzes supposedly fled their haunted house, a local TV crew did a short segment about this property. As part of their story, they placed a camera on the second floor with an automatic timer that would allow it to take a series of shots. Most of the photographs showed nothing but an empty landing. One photograph caught this surprising image. The child in the photograph is believed to be the ghost of John DeFeo, who was 9 years old when he died. As for Ronald DeFeo Junior, he died in prison in March of 2021 when he was 69 years old. His body was cremated and his ashes were buried at the DeFeo family plot in Brooklyn. So what do you think? Did someone on this news crew fake this photograph, or was this really a picture of John DeFeo's ghost? If this was his ghost, why haven't there been any other sightings? Does his spirit still linger on at this address, or do you think that he's moved on? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.
If you liked this video and would like to see more content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons.